Email did the same fingerprint test page in 6 browsers on one laptop last month. 4 of them handed back a graphics hash that identified the machine on every reload. One gave a different answer each time. One refused to draw the image at all. Same hardware, same network, 6 different answers about who I was. So here is the verdict first, because you should not have to sit through 11 minutes to get it. Brave and Firefox on its strict setting do the most out of the box. Safari blocks third-party cookies properly, then hands your searches to an advertising company by default. Edge blocks a fair amount and reports plenty back to Microsoft. Chrome does the least about tracking for a reason that is structural rather than lazy. And all of that matters less than whether you have a content blocker installed. That is the part almost nobody leads with. Why you should weigh what I say. I run mobile proxy infrastructure for a living. Real SIM cards in modems, rented to businesses that need traffic leaving from a particular carrier. So my week is spent on the other side of this, watching how sites tell one visitor from another. The address your traffic arrives from is one signal among dozens and nowhere near the strongest. I have watched a site connect 2 of my own browser profiles while they were sitting on completely separate mobile lines because both drew the same test image the same way. Different addresses, different logins, one machine underneath. It took a single page load. That is what your browser choice is up against. The 5 questions that actually separate them. Most comparisons score browsers on a feeling. Here are the questions that pull them apart. Does it block third-party cookies by default with no setting for you to find? Does it do anything about fingerprinting? And if so, is that randomizing your signals or making you look like everybody else? Those are opposite strategies, and they fail in opposite ways. Does it block the tracking request, or let it through and file the cookie in a separate box per site? What does it send home about you, and who pays for it? That last one makes people uncomfortable, so let me take it first. Who pays and why that sets a ceiling? A browser built by an advertising company has a limit on how far it will go against tracking. Call that arithmetic, not an accusation. Nobody has to be a villain for the ceiling to exist. Chrome comes from a company whose revenue is overwhelmingly advertising. Google spent years announcing the end of third-party cookies in Chrome, moved the date 4 times, and in 2025 abandoned the deprecation altogether. The replacement was a set of in-browser targeting interfaces, your interests calculated on your own machine and handed to advertisers as topics. By late 2025, several of those were being retired. So the third-party cookie outlived both the plan to kill it and the thing built to replace it. Safari is the interesting case because Apple sells hardware and can afford to be hostile to trackers. It blocks third-party cookies outright. It also takes a payment reported at around $20 billion a year to keep Google as the default search engine. The browser blocks the trackers and the search box belongs to the advertising company. Raspberry gets most of its revenue from a search deal with that same company. Magellan has been building an advertising business since around 2024, which produced an attribution experiment switched on by default and a terms of use rewrite that upset a lot of long-standing users. Brave has an advertising business too, and it is worth being fair about the shape of it. Brave ads are matched on your device, with no cross-site identity trailing you between sites. It is still an advertising business and worth knowing before you treat Brave as a neutral referee. Tor browser runs on grants, historically a large share from United States government sources. I find that less alarming than a search deal because a grant creates no daily commercial incentive to keep you legible. The word that hides the difference, here is where the marketing gets slippery. There are 2 ways to deal with a cookie set by a company that is not the site you are on. You can refuse it, or you can accept it and lock it in a jar labeled with the site you are visiting, so the same tracker on a different site gets a different jar and cannot join the 2. The second one is partitioning. Firefox calls it total cookie protection, and it is genuinely good engineering. It is also a long way from blocking. The request still goes out. The tracker still runs. It simply cannot correlate you across sites using that cookie. Safari refuses most of them outright and has since 2020. Brave blocks them by default. Firefox on its standard setting partitions, and on strict it starts blocking known trackers properly. Edge on its balanced default blocks trackers from sites you have never visited, which leaves a gap the size of the very large companies whose sites you visit constantly. Chrome, in 2026, still accepts third-party cookies by default. You can turn them off in settings and it takes about 20 seconds. Almost nobody does. Randomization against standardization. Fingerprinting is where the strategies genuinely diverge, and the difference matters more than any feature list. Your browser leaks a description of your machine to every site it talks to. Installed fonts, screen dimensions, time zones, the precise way your graphics hardware renders a test image. Combine enough and you have an identifier that survives clearing your cookies. One approach is randomizations. Brave does this and calls it farbling. Every site, every session gets slightly different answers to the fingerprinting questions. You are never the same person twice. The other approach is standardization. Tor browser and Malware browser take this route. Everybody reports the same fonts, the same rounded window size, the same graphics behavior, so you are indistinguishable from every other user of that browser. Both work. Both break differently. Randomization kills the naive case code and it hands a determined tracker something to average. Visit enough times and the noise cancels while the machine underneath stays put. It also makes you conspicuous, because being unlike yourself on every reload is itself rare. Standardization is powerful when the crowd is large and worthless when it is small. And you shrink that crowd yourself, constantly. You resize the window, you install an extension, you add a language pack. Every personalization steps you back out of the herd. Safari takes a third route closer to reduction. It just reports less. Fewer fonts, a simplified system profile, no answer at all to some questions. That shrinks the surface without pretending to be someone else. Chrome does effectively nothing here. In early 2025, Google went the other way on its advertising side and began permitting fingerprinting-based targeting its own rules had banned. Walmart's ended Ola Justasen. Edge ships with the most telemetry switched on of anything here, and Windows updates have a habit of turning parts of it back on. Chrome ties the browser to your account the moment you sign in. Firefox asks and lets you decline. Brave and Safari send the least. That is a separate question from tracking, and worth knowing which one you are actually worried about. The misunderstanding that beats all the others. Private mode, incognito, whatever your browser calls it. It deletes the local traces when you close the window. History, cookies, form entries, the session itself. That is the entire feature. It does not hide you from the site you are visiting. It does not hide you from your internet provider, your employer, your school, or the network you are sitting on. It will not make you anonymous to a company you are signed into in another window. What it protects you from is the next person to use your computer. That is the threat model it was designed for. Google was sued over exactly this confusion, and the case settled in 2024 with an agreement to delete browsing records and rewrite the incognito splash screen. The wording is better now. The belief has not caught up. Private mode is a housekeeping feature. Take that away if nothing else. Why your extension matters more than your browsers. For most people, the content blocker is the whole game. A decent blocker stops the tracking request before it leaves. No request, no cookie, no fingerprint script running, and the page that renders faster for not fetching 40 scripts from hosts you have never heard of. Which is why the most consequential browser change of the last 2 years had nothing to do with privacy features. Chrome finished migrating to its new extension platform and cut off the capabilities the strongest blockers depended on. The full version of the blocker most people relied on no longer runs there. What remains is a reduced edition working from a fixed rule list. Firefox kept supporting the old platform. Brave kept a version of it working on its own terms. So if you use Chrome with a blocker, your protection quietly dropped a notch, and nobody told you. That reshuffles this comparison more than any fingerprinting theater. The thing I got wrong? For about a year, I set up hardened Firefox profiles for friends and family. Resist fingerprinting on, strict mode, third-party cookies that, the lot. I was pleased with myself. I checked back roughly 9 months later. Every one of them had either switched the protections off or gone back to Chrome. One had a banking login that would not complete. One had a work sign-on page that spun forever. One just wanted a video to play on a Saturday, so the protection I delivered was zero. Worse than zero, because they now believe privacy tooling breaks your computer. My mistake was measuring the configuration instead of what survived contact with a person's week. I now hand people a weaker setup that they keep: a mainstream browser, third-party cookies off, a real blocker, and nothing that makes their bank angry. That is the failure mode behind every strict privacy benchmark you will read. The most protective configuration breaks enough sites that real-world protection lands well below the score. What breaks? Specifically, sign-on flows are the big one. Plenty of them still pass identity through a third-party cookie, and when you kill those, the login loop just spins. Embedded payment frames, embedded video from certain providers, support chat widgets, sites routing their own images through a domain your blocker list happens to include. With fingerprint resistance turned all the way up, things fail in ways that do not look like privacy at all. A video that will not decode, a map that renders blank, a chart that comes out as an empty rectangle. The fix is per-site exceptions, and almost nobody makes per-site exceptions. What I would actually tell you to do, a mainstream browser with a good content blocker and third-party cookies off. That is where the large majority of people should stop. If you want that with the least effort, Brave out of the box gets you most of the way. Or Firefox on strict with the blocker you already trust. On Apple hardware, Safari with a blocker is a defensible answer, and change the search engine while you are there. If you are on Chrome and staying, turn off third-party cookies today and understand your blocker is now the weaker editions. Tor browser is for a threat model, where somebody is actively trying to identify you and the consequence is serious. It is slow, it breaks constantly, and ordinary browsing on it means you will eventually stop. Molvet browser is the middle ground, the standardized fingerprint on the ordinary internet without the onion routing. Then stop tuning. The returns fall off a cliff after the blocker, and the time is better spent on the accounts you stay signed into, because those identify you by name, whichever browser is doing the asking. The full browser test notes and the settings I actually run are at theprivacywire.com. Subscribe for privacy advice that is actually practical.